If you want to understand how women flirt, you need a better system, not just better luck. I used to miss flirting signals all the time, just because I was looking for the wrong thing. I expected the obvious version, the movie version. That is not how it usually works. Most of the time, I was standing there, waiting for a clear signal, while the real signal had already happened 3 seconds earlier. I just didn't read it. And that's the problem with flirting. It's rarely one big move. It's usually a cluster of small things that are easy to miss if you are only waiting for the obvious. You can't read flirting by looking at one signal at a time. You always need the full pattern, because the real flirt is usually spread across several small details. Point 1. Subtle flirting. This is where most flirting starts, long before anyone says anything useful. I used to think the first sign would be something dramatic. It almost never is. A head tilt, a longer glance and a small smile, a shift in posture when you walk into the space, sometimes even slower blinking, or a little extra attention to how they look while you are nearby. That matters because the body often reacts before the mouth does. Psychologically, this is where attraction starts to become visible. Not loud, not obvious. Just readable if you know what to look for. Monica Moore's research on women's nonverbal courtship behavior found that these kinds of signals show up a lot in early flirting. That is why body language is the safest first move. It lets her show interest without making herself too exposed. That is the whole game at the start. Show enough to be noticed, not enough to be trapped. Point 2. Intentional flirting. This is where things get more specific. Subtle flirting says, I am open. Intentional flirting says, I am opening this interaction on purpose. That can look like a question that goes a little deeper than normal, a playful comment, a future reference, a laugh that feels slightly too interested in the wrong joke, or a tiny bit of teasing that creates a private lane between the two of you. Here is what most men miss. Women often do not flirt by being direct first. They make the interaction feel more personal than it needs to be. That is why clusters matter. One laugh does not mean anything by itself, but a laugh plus eye contact, plus leaning in, now the pattern starts speaking. This is also where social risk starts to matter. If she goes too direct too early and you do not respond well, she risks embarrassment. So a lot of women keep the signal just vague enough to give themselves an exit. That is not confusion. That is strategy. Flirting often lives in the space between I like you and I can still pretend I was just being friendly. And yes, that awkward middle zone is exactly where most of the real stuff happens. A single sign is noise. A pattern is data. Point 3, the context rule. The same signal can mean something completely different depending on distance, location, and situation. If she is across the room, she has to use bigger signals. A glance, a visible smile, a small body turn, something clear enough to travel. If she's already close to you, the signals get smaller. A slight lean, a soft touch on the arm, a head angle, a slower reply. Less about broadcasting, more about inviting. That is why reading flirt without context is useless. You cannot treat a bar, a classroom, a party, and a quiet one-on-one conversation the same way. The environment changes what a signal has to do. If the room is loud, the body gets louder. If the space is intimate, the body gets quieter. Same attraction, different volume. This is where people make the dumbest mistakes. They see one smile and decide it means nothing, or one playful touch and decide it means everything. Both are lazy reads. The real answer is usually in the combination of cues and where they happen. If you only look at the behavior and ignore the setting, you are reading half the sentence. And that is where a lot of men finally realize something useful. Women do not always make one giant move because the whole system is built around reducing social risk. Point 4, direct flirting. This is the stage people usually think comes first, but it often comes later than most men expect. At this point, the signal becomes harder to hide. Longer eye contact, more personal questions, more obvious jokes, less distance, more permission to continue. Sometimes the voice gets higher, the energy gets more animated, or the interaction gets harder to hide. And that does not always mean nerves in a bad way. Sometimes it means interest is pulling harder than control. This is also where you need to avoid the biggest male mistake. Assuming direct flirting means a confession. It usually does not. It means the signal became strong enough that you can respond without guessing in the dark anymore. That is all. You still have to move cleanly. You still have to be readable, but now the doors open wider. That is why flirting can look like a joke, a pause, a look, a question, a tiny touch, or a future reference before it ever looks like I am interested. It is not random, it is layered. What can we take away from this? Direct flirting is usually the result, not the beginning. Point 5, the cluster test. That is where flirting gets more obvious because the signal no longer has to stay hidden. This is the part that saves you from overreacting to one gesture. One laugh, one touch, one smile is not enough. You need a cluster. That means more than one cue has to line up. So you are reading pattern, not accident. Look for overlap. Eye contact plus body turn, smile plus lingering attention, teasing plus follow-up questions, proximity plus touch. That is where the truth gets harder to deny. Not in the single cue, in the pattern that keeps repeating. One signal opens the next, then suddenly the interaction has a shape to it. If you learn nothing else from this video, learn this. Do not look for the one magical sign that solves everything. Look for the sequence. That is what separates guessing from reading. And that is what most men never learn, because they are too busy waiting for a neon sign with a subtitle. What I'm trying to say is, she does not have to say it outright for the pattern to be real. Point 6. Why women keep it vague. This part matters more than people like to admit. Flirting is often vague because vagueness protects both sides. If she is too direct and you are not interested, she loses face. If she is too obvious and you misread it, she loses deniability. So, a lot of flirting lives in that careful middle ground where interest is felt but not fully exposed. That is not weakness. That is social intelligence. And if you understand that, you stop expecting women to behave like men in a romantic script. Their flirting is more indirect and more dependent on the room than your ego wants to admit. Your job is to notice how often the same signal comes back. That is the real skill, pattern recognition. And once you get good at that, you stop missing what was already in front of you. You stop reacting late. You start reading the room in real time. By the time most men realize a woman was flirting, the moment is already gone. Not because women are impossible to read, but because most men are looking for the wrong kind of obvious. If you watch the cluster, the context, and the sequence, the picture gets much clearer.